Checking her phone app one more time before turning off the lamp beside her bed, Katie opened the Google News app with a plan to just check the leading headline so she could stay informed about the world around her, then turn off the phone screen and the lamp and fall asleep. However, an hour later, she had finished reading every news article in her news app, and she felt even more anxious than she did when she initially lay down to get a good night's rest. According to a report aired on NPR, since the beginning of the pandemic, persons like Katie are increasingly binging on the news, specifically doomsday news, hence the trending term, doom scrolling. Doom scrolling is the act of endlessly scrolling through news apps like Twitter and social media and reading all the bad news. One person confessed that they have an unsatisfying addiction as they doom scroll around 10 times a day, even though they admit there is nothing specifically they are looking for in the news. Yet remaining informed doesn't make them feel any safer, as the doomsday news only creates greater fear, anxiety, and stress. Doom scrolling and binging on bad news, according to NPR, erodes our mental health and contributes to many persons spiraling deeper into despair. No one knows this better than a friend who served on a cruise line vessel in 2001. Her job was to announce the news reports and a brief synopsis of major headlines while the ship was out at sea. Though she typically said she found good news to counter the bad news so she could create an emotional balance for herself, she said she lost herself when the planes took down the trade towers and her job was to give daily updates regarding the information they received. Though it took time for her to mentally heal, she said she felt she had been buried under the weight of the doomsday news as there was no bright future ahead. Prior to mending, her mental state was probably similar to the three women who visited the tomb on Easter morning, and they were quite likely the very first doom scrollers. In the Gospel of Mark, Mary Magdalene, Mary, the mother of James, and Salome brought spices so that they could anoint Jesus' body while he lay in the tomb. Filled with gloom and spiraling deeper into despair, they made their way to the cave-like tomb. So filled with grief, they were already on their way to the cemetery when they realized they had not thought about how they could move the large capstone which covered the tomb. As they walked together, their anxiety increased, realizing they had not thoroughly planned ahead, nor considered who or what they might encounter in the garden. Would the grave be surrounded by Roman guards? What would happen to them if Jesus' opponents saw them? Each step toward the cemetery led to an increased level of danger and despair. None of the women expected to find good news. They certainly weren't expecting a resurrection, especially after they were present at Jesus' execution and they witnessed everything that occurred. When they found the stone had been rolled away from the tomb, certainly they would not have expected to find good news. Cautiously, they approached the tomb to doom scroll further as they expected to discover additional bad news. Instead, their grief was interrupted by a young man dressed in a white robe, sitting on the right side, who effectively said, "I know you're here for Jesus, but he's not here. You need to do something with your despair. There's a good life for you in front of you. So go now and tell the disciples and others what I'm telling you. Jesus has been raised and will meet with you and the disciples in Galilee." Feeling a mixture of terror and amazement, the women fled from the tomb to find the disciples. They were not quite ready to accept the good news that the man had told them, which is natural. Anytime we are surrounded by bad news or constantly subjected to it, it's tough to accept or even believe that something positive could be found or encountered. And living in daily fear, it can take some time to overcome our anxiety or our negative outlook. Sure, we can turn off the news and phone app at night, but escaping that anxious feeling of doom and gloom is not easy. Fortunately, Dr. Amelia Adalo, an expert in the field of coping with grief and loss, As the solution to doom scrolling is to break out of the vicious cycle of negativity. For us, that might mean swapping vicious cycles for virtuous cycles, which Dr. Adalo says means keeping a balance in your life of negative news and discovering hidden potentials and good news in your life. For the women at the tomb, the good news of Easter revealed that God had acted in their lives to break the vicious cycle of negativity. And like the women, we are invited to experience their joy as they saw the stone rolled back and they discovered that Jesus had indeed been raised to life. We're invited to shake off the vicious cycle of negativity in our lives and recognize that God promises us a wonderful future, not just in some afterlife, but here in the present. One of the easy mistakes we make is viewing the scriptural text as some document written in the past. Granted, the Bible contains an ancient record of God's activity and how our ancestors responded to those actions. But at its core, the Bible is about going forward, not backward. And though many of us recognize that one does not go forward if they're staring in the rearview mirror, still doom scrolling reveals that we are drawn to looking backward at the past events to know what took place. We are drawn to the scrapbooks of faith, the journey through the cemetery, and the longing for days past. Yet the God of Scripture is always out ahead of us, leading us into the future, which we are informed is bright with promise and hope. This bright future of promise and hope was true for the women on Easter morning, as it was true for Moses. When Moses was called to lead the Hebrews out of slavery, God promised him and the Hebrews access to a bright and wonderful future of grand possibilities. However, Moses was constantly surrounded by negativity, and therefore it was tough to convince him of those grand possibilities. So he demanded that God name God's self. And though it's typically translated as God's response being as, I am who I am, the Hebrew verb in this phrase is not actually present tense. God's response was more like, I will be what I will be. This is God's way of saying, my name is future tense. And jumping ahead to the New Testament, we discover Paul understood what God was doing as he wrote to the church, encouraging them to look forward by not looking at what lies behind. And therefore, he says, do not focus on past mistakes or regrets, but strain forward for what lies ahead, for what our risen Lord has waiting for us. To begin with, the stone has been rolled away, and with it, our fears of the future are rolled away as well. Though we want to remain focused on the doom and gloom of the world, insisting that our dreams have died with this pandemic. And we may be convinced by headlines that even with vaccines, 120 persons recently became infected, or that hospitals are once again being overwhelmed with a surge of COVID patients. And granted, these headlines fill us with dread and anxiety, but equally so, we are encouraged to recognize that God is still doing good things and still promises a future of wonderful things. The young man at the tomb invited the women to see for themselves that Jesus was not there, that he had gone ahead of them to show his grace, his love, and his power. The tomb is empty and Christ is alive. This is the title of a hymn we will sing a little later this morning, and it was written by Brian Wren specifically for Easter Sunday in 1968, just 10 days after the assassination of Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. Brian said he wanted to stay in the cemetery. He wanted to just sit and weep instead of acknowledging the arrival of Easter. But he said in his desire to sit and weep and give up on hope, he encountered Christ. And immediately he says he sprung to his desk to write the hymn, to acknowledge this terrible loss while also proclaiming the resurrection of Jesus. He wrote, "Christ is alive. Let Christians sing. The cross stands empty to the sky. Let streets and homes with praises ring. Love drowned in death shall never die." As the hymn suggests, the resurrection is not stuck in history, but is a reality for everyone for all times, especially as the risen Christ is encountered whenever a stranger is welcomed, a child is loved, a friend is forgiven, or an injustice is made right. In the face of today's racism and violence, Jesus suffers still, yet loves the more. For Jesus is present, and he's touching every life and dream, encouraging us to set aside our doom and gloom so we enter into an incredible future with him. Truly, Jesus is not dead in the tomb. Instead, he is alive, and he's found in every one of us as we embrace and act with justice, with love, and with praise. We are encouraged to release our anxiety and apprehension about the future and embrace each other by seeing that Christ is present in us and in the people around us. He's also visible in our future because Jesus is not just simply with us, he is also ahead of us, calling us into the future which he is preparing for us. We simply have to move beyond doom scrolling so that we see him. Going where Christ leads us, we can break the vicious cycle and move into the virtuous cycle. After all, God makes possible the impossible, and God resurrects life where there was death, and God constantly replaces gloom with happiness. All of this was fulfilled when Jesus left the tomb to sit empty as he went ahead of his disciples to Galilee. And he's still doing the same for us when he removes our fears of failure and dying. And he says, "I am doing a new thing for you and with you." Don't dwell on the past and don't get bogged down in believing it's over. There is new life available to you. Don't be filled with gloom, but embrace the joy that is being sent, which is opening great and wonderful opportunities to you. New possibilities in the world and new possibilities for the ministry and mission of the church. Also, he says, be prepared and be open to the possibilities for justice and righteousness in our community and in our nation. God says, I am giving resurrection power to the world. So don't focus on the doom and gloom. Instead, recognize that the stones in your life have been rolled away so that together we go forward with Christ.